thought of thinking about this issue of time space that were at the core of our symposium. So, Theodor, the floor is yours. I cannot remember if you want to share some PowerPoint with us. No?
Me? No, him.
No, you share them directly. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Okay.
So, Theodor, the floor is yours. And again,
okay.
we're very happy to have your presence in the context of this symposium.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much for inviting me. I wish I was there in person. Being in Grenoble in the winter would be great. And but I want to thank the organizers, Francois and Sabine, for this, giving me this opportunity to meet and talk with you. Let me share my screen a bit here. So I should want to say something by way of explanation of the title. So when I was contacted about contributing something, I really didn't have time to prepare a real talk. And luckily, the organizers suggested that I speak about my 2010 book, The Timespace of Human Activity. So that was a welcome suggestion. And so what I'm going to do is, we are all aware, of course, that there's a relentless digitalization of the worlds that we occupy occurring. And by digitalization, I mean the pervasive spread of digital devices and infrastructures and human engagement with them and their structuring of our lives. And so I thought, since this phenomena is of interest to me and I've been thinking about it for some time now, I thought, well, one thing I could do vis-a-vis this 2010 book would be to take some of the theses that were enunciated in that book and to ask whether what their fate is given the occurrence of digitalization. And thus the title, Time, Space, Times, a multiplication sign, Digitality. And digitality, I don't mean anything fancy. It's just like digital things that in English, otherwise one might speak of the digital. And I should explain that more precisely when I speak of digital and digitalization, what I'm interested in more expansively can be sort of described as algorithmic computational organization and shaping. Okay, so it's the particular form, that way in which digitality is entering our lives in recent times that I'm interested in. Okay, so now, oops, there we go. So there's a background question here, which pertains to, why juxtapose time space, or to multiply time space time digitality. And it is that people have wondered whether this relentless digitalization challenges existing social theories. That is, whether existing social theories are adequate to give illuminating analyses of a digitalizing social world. And I'm not really going to address this issue, but I do want to say a few words about how my talk today is an exploration of this topic. So I don't think a question like this is way too general in a way, because different theories of society are likely to be challenged or potentially challenged differently by digitalization. So just for the purposes of the present discussion, I'm going to differentiate basically between two families of social theories. One includes ontological positions such as individualism, interactionism, the various pragmatist lines would be here, practice theory. I would put actor network theory in here too, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, there's a variety of structuralist, systems-oriented, assemblage kind of based accounts. And the rough and ready kind of principle of differentiation here is the first group still pretty much highlights human beings as central, as perhaps the center of the social. And so the second group is not. So that becomes a relevant fault line in thinking about digitalization and theories of society. And taking this first group, the individualisms, practice theories, interactionisms, etc., there are all kinds of possible challenges. You know, digitalization brings about new entities. Digitalization perhaps introduces new forms of causality into social life, maybe new principles of organization, and so forth. Now, I'm not sure what the answer to this question is, this general question, vis-a-vis this first group, but I want to make the following observation, that I believe that the great challenge posed to these more humanistic theories of social life is that it comes through the fact that with digitalization, we have the introduction of smart systems, which are far more capable and that have taken on far more of the mental and behavioral capacities of humans than previous human artifacts have. And so this is a theme, of course, of Stiegler's, which I think is very important. And what's, to me, significant about these smart systems in the current context is that there's been, of course, a long line of decenterings of the human in theory now for quite some time. These decenterings have been largely in the realm of theory. So there's, you know, doorstops decenter humans, scallops decenter humans, power plants, women and European human, non-European humans. And so these are all associated with prominent writers who herald the decentering of humans. But it's all in theory. The introduction of smart systems is real decentering and far more significant than the theoretical moves. And to me, what's ultimately at stake here is, in fact, the integrity of the mental, actional dimensions of human life and social phenomena. And I wasn't going to read a quote from Stiegler, who I think captures this very well. And I do think that herein lies a great challenge to practice theories, because practice theories tend to be pretty humanist, and anything that's humanist, there's a new type of challenge that's magnitudes greater than, I think, the theoretical challenges that have existed over the last 30 years. Of course, they go back earlier than just 30 years. Okay, I'm, in a sense, today going to take up this issue in the context of my 2010 book and look at some possible challenges that digitalization is presenting to at least my version of practice theory, and it is very much derives from the decentering that I just mentioned. So, okay, so first let me just say a few words about some of the themes in this book, because I'm going to actively engage a few of them in a few minutes. So first, there's a great contrast between what we might call the time of reality, the time of the world, on the one hand, and what David Hoy spoke of as the times of our lives. That is, time and space as aspects or phenomena of human life in some sense, as opposed to a time and space which are characteristics of the universe. And the way I make out this distinction is in terms of objective versus existential. It's not the only way of doing it. Objective time simply means time and space insofar as they persist independently of human activity and apprehension. It's the persistence that counts. one might think, for instance, that, one prominent objective time, the time of the world, for instance, often equated with calendars and clocks. Calendars and clocks are our invention. Norbert Elias wrote a great book making this very, very clear. And nonetheless, what is measured by calendars and clocks persists independently of us. So it's a combination. So objective, I mean, that's a longer discussion there. Okay, now, existential time space. The time in the book, I argue that the time or the temporality or in the space or the spatiality are teleologically unified. I'm not going to go into that, and form a time space. And keeping the world, the time of the world versus the time of human lives. There are of course, plenty of notions of space time with a hyphen, found both in the physical sciences, but also in social theory. And so I differentiate time space as a unified phenomenon of human life versus space-time as the conjointed dimensions of objective space and objective time. And then another large theme in this book, now time space is strictly speaking a feature of activities, or derivatively of individual people's lives. However, the strictly speaking different time spaces of different people's lives interweave, and they interweave by virtue of common, shared, and orchestrated elements. And common means enjoined, for instance, by some normative structure. Shared means contingently the same. So you may have people who, let's say, work for a firm who are, what they are aiming at is specified somehow in the structure of the firm. That becomes a common future. A share would just mean that it happens to be that two people share the same future. And orchestrated, I'm just going to skip over this because it comes up later on. Orchestrated means that the time and the time space of two different lives are different, but interdependent. And by virtue of this commonness, sharedness, orchestratedness, the different time spaces of people's lives are interwoven. And by the way, time is the forward projecting teleological dimension of human activity. And I'm sorry, that's the future. And the past then becomes where a person is coming from, what they are reacting to in acting. So that's temporality. And by spatiality, just for the moment, what I mean is an array of places and paths to perform actions that are anchored in the circumjacent environment. That's the environment about a person as they progress through the course of their day. And this, of course, is coordinated in all sorts of ways with human activity and practices. And the way practices come in here is that commonness, sharedness, and orchestration derives from the fact that people carry out the same practices amid the same material world. And that in that context, their time spaces come to be common, shared, and orchestrated. This then brings us to the time space infrastructure of social phenomena. Social phenomena, briefly, I think of as nexes of practices and material arrangements. And so people, any social phenomena, which involves multiple humans participating in the relevant practices, the time spaces of those individuals' lives will exhibit commonality, sharedness, and orchestration. And so this becomes an infrastructure that runs through a social phenomenon. And then here briefly, 5 is chapter 3, 6 is chapter 4 in the book. Chapter 3, I really like. I don't think anyone's read it. It's an attempt to give a theory of activity. Its basic point is that practically all human activity is teleological. And I try to show that by examining emotional action, that is action that is partly dependent on emotion, also ritual and how ritual is teleological action. And then I make a claim and spell it out that all practices exhibit a ceremonial character. So we'll come back to that one vis-a-vis digitality. And then finally, these are just a series of themes in chapter 6. I'm sorry, in chapter 4. These are not going to come up today, so I'm not going to say anything about them. Okay, we are going to touch on 2, 3, and 5 in thinking about challenges emerging from digitality. Okay, so now let's have some common examples before us. And let me move. So these are just examples of digitalization of everyday lives, and I'm going to utilize these examples in what follows. So, of course, we all type now. Children are expert typers. There's a decline in handwriting, and so that's an interesting effect of digitalization. Industrial floor organization, of course, is quite different now, both the practices involved and the introduction of robotics completely changes this. Self-driving cars, even though they may not exist for a long, long time, still is it's a good example of something that I want to talk about. Finally, then playing a massive multi-person online, I could have put locative game there. That's a phenomenon I want to talk about. Then the way in which a person's situation, in the good old sociological sense of situation is shaped algorithmically, by all the way in which our lives proceed in terms of and on the background of infrastructures of digital devices. So our situation is shaped, and also the self, the sense of identity, the preferences, desire, and so forth, are all clearly shaped in that situation. Specifically in social media, the way in which what people strive to be, what what they value, how they measure themselves against other people, and their sense of selves, of course, are very tied to this algorithmic sort of shaping of what appears on screens and how we interact them. And then finally, shopping. We all know this one, online shopping versus in-person shopping. So those are the examples. And what I've got now and how much I talk at this point will depend on time. I have 5 themes of where there's a kind of challenge occurring to practice theory in these examples here. So the first one is the way in which digitalization can lead to the fragmentation and withering of practices. So the theme I want to pick up here is, we all know, and this is a great theme of Stiegler's, but it has advanced in a particular way recently, and that's the way in which humans delegate tasks to devices. And of course, they've been doing this for a long time, but we do this now to smart systems, which are capable of doing a far greater range of things that hitherto had been done by humans than before. So when we hand delegate tasks to digital infrastructures, we're actually fragmenting practices, because the tasks previously had been part of the performing of certain practices. So that practice suddenly becomes thinner. And that opens the question, is what is its fate then? And so, for instance, the self-driving cars is an extreme example of this, because if in fact there were self-driving cars, then driving practices would basically disappear. And of course, this, one can imagine this in a variety of ways. Writing by hand may disappear, more or less, or become sort of an exotic cult type of activity sometime in the future. Think about even a simple example as shopping, where there's a whole, I'll talk about this when we talk of ceremonial in this, there's a whole ritual. There are rituals in the store that and the practices that are carried out there, and they involve, for instance, a certain level of interaction. And if you shop online, that becomes significantly fragmented, and much of it withers. And then once it's fragmented, one can imagine some of the fragments being taken up into different practices. So what does this mean for practice theory now? Well, I do think that basically all technological innovations have had this effect throughout history. You know, whatever technology is introduced. So, for instance, you know, cars, when cars were introduced, they had this, you know, eventually this similar kind of effect vis-a-vis what previous forms of transportation had been. So, for instance, the use of horses, which slowly withered away, and fragments of which were picked up into car. So, for instance, the driving on the right or the left-hand side of the road was a reflection of how people on horses would pass one another. And so it was just picked up and carried over into, so, and, or the way, I mean, thinking, you know, new technologies introduced into farming practices, of course, the practices change. Some of them wither, some fragment, some develop in various ways. And one can do even sort of large-scale analyses of introduction of alphabets and numerals, considering them technology as well. And so this is often the effect. The introduction of new technology has the effect of fragmenting, withering, and reorganizing and enabling the emergence of new practices. So to me, in one sense, this observation is old hat. It simply points to the mutability of practice constellations. But it does, and of course, some of the changes can be quite dramatic in connection with digital devices. And so, for instance, the very fact that I'm giving this talk in this way is a good example. This is a pretty dramatic change in academic practices, and, you know, in some form or other, is relatively permanent. So this first observation about fragmentation and withering that occurs with the delegation of tasks, which is only enhanced with digital, much more capable, smart devices, this is not a challenge to practice theory, it seems to me. Okay, now ceremonialness. This is the second point up here. In the book, I argue that all practices have what Wendy James, who's a Cambridge Oxford anthropologist, calls a ceremonial grammar, and that's based. She is a Wittgensteinian, and she argues that there is that all practices, and I think she's right, have the ceremonial grammar, and there are the three elements up on the screen. There are certain rules about space and time, which includes the spatiality and temporality of life. There are certain rules at work. There a sense of action sequencing and the form that interpersonal relations take. And then there's a certain style and rhythm to it. Now, with digitality, practices begin to lose their ceremonial character. I mean, it's sort of like, to use a slogan, it takes two to tango. But we don't have to when the other is a digital device, at least not yet, though maybe we're moving in that direction. And so this loses some of the ceremonial. So consider buying and selling and the contrast between doing so online and doing so in person. When you do so in person, there are all kinds of rules about space and timing in the store, interacting with the employees and the other customers. There's the sequence, style, rhythm, but these are absent when you're purchasing something online. There is no rule about space. There could be something about time. You know, you're only given so many minutes to make the purchase before you lose it or something like that. But action sequencing, interpersonal relations, style and rhythm, they seem to be pretty gone, though maybe styles of online purchasing will arise, which we don't really have. And this is all because what we're interacting with is a smart device in some sense, which is algorithmic and computational and has no need of any of this. And thus we no longer proceed this way. Now, not all digitality is like this. So let me give you an example, which I'm going to come back to later on. A colleague of mine here at Kentucky has written an interesting book called Intersectional Tech. And what it is she's looking at the phenomena of people live streaming themselves while they play some game. So there are other people watching them play the game, and there's then, a dialogue possibly between them. And she looks at, this is in the United States, so African-American males, African-American females, and African-American lesbians. And in fact, one sees there's much more of the ceremonialness retained in that practice where the people are watching the person. And this clearly has to do with the visibility and the interactivity dimension of those practices. And so there's a caveat here that the more that the type of goings on supported by digitality resemble prior practices in that interactive visible element, the more they stay like the practices. It's to some extent when that is absent. Now, visibility, I mean human-to-human visibility, because of course, when we use, there's another sense of visibility in which the use of where we are visible to others, to algorithms, etc., to institutions by virtue of engaging. And so that's a different sense. So I do mean visual visibility here. And okay, so and so ceremonialness disappears, and the cultural theorist Byung-Chul Han, in his book Non-Things, argues that rituals give stability to the temporal element of social life. So if, in fact, we are losing the ceremonialness, then that suggests does that mean there's less stability that's introduced into social life? I don't know the answer to the question, but I'm just putting the two observations together. So this is a significant effect, I think, of digitalization. But I don't think what's interesting, I don't think it overturns or really challenges practice theory. It rather challenges the thesis I made that practices generally have a ceremonial character. In making that, I was not paying attention to the type of digital practices that we're developing. And my only excuse is, of course, the book was written some time ago, but that's no good. So anyway, so that is certainly a change. Okay, now, I can't remember, how much longer should I talk? This will determine how many more examples we go. Sorry?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah,
12, 15 minutes would be good. 12 would be better.
Okay, so let me skip over, let me skip over this point, because what this point is the way that digitalization can greatly shape the temporal and spatial dimensions of human life. And there's endless examples one can give here. And instead, let me move on to the doubling of teleology. Okay, so this is a curious phenomena that is actually very widespread in social life. It's the phenomena where a person pursues multiple ends simultaneously, and not because they're a particularly flexible person involved in lots of domains, but rather because by virtue of being a member of some larger collective entity, teleology is doubled. And so when you act as part of a group, or an organization or basically almost any form of association, you both might have what we would call a personal end that you're pursuing, but there also could be a group or organizational end at the same time. That is, one has reasons for performing a particular action, one owns reasons, or in carrying on a particular practice. But in performing this action or engaging in the practice, one is also pursuing a group or an organizational end. So a good easy example of this is sports. A person may have all kinds of personal reasons for not just engaging in sports, but being out there on the field, the pitch, on a given day. So it could be, doing one's job. It could be, team loyalty. It could be the pursuit of fame and riches or whatever. But at the same time, that's one's personal end. One is also trying to win the game, right? That's the group aim. That's the team's aim. And there are endless examples of this in social life. And now here's why I want to bring in the massive multiplayer online games, because these are role-playing games typically. And by virtue of that, one is member of some group in the game. So simultaneously, one has one's motives, one's ends for playing the game, and then in the playing of the game, one has a second set of ends. And so, for instance, gamers, people who play in these games often are personally seeking sociality, to be with their friends, that kind of thing. And of course, then there's whatever the end as specified in the game is, which is usually some form of victory or conquering or accumulation of something. And so this is a curious phenomenon. So I find these massive online games really quite interesting. And this is definitely a very curious phenomenon here. But it's actually, to me, just more of the same. It's no different than being a member of a sports team and having. The only difference, of course, is that the carrying out of the practice is essentially tied to what appears on a screen in front of a person who can apprehend the screen and interact with its contents. And that makes it quite different than playing a football match. But however, from a point of view of social theory, it's not really any different. So to me, there's no significant challenge to this temporal dimension posed in this way by massive games. All right, so let's turn to space, and that'd be the last thing I talk about. So I have argued that the spatial dimension of social affairs can be analyzed in terms of three notions of space. So they're mentioned up here. First, objective space. This is space that is tied to the distribution of material entities in the world. And then there's this the arrays of places and paths, the spatiality of time-space. So these are anchored in the circumjacent environment. And finally, there's what is in all kinds of social theory, especially in sort of geography connected, we talk about places. And to differentiate the two, I'll say encompassing places. And this is the sort of, examples would be like the workplace, the town square, home, a train compartment, or something. And I understand that somebody this is a meaningful, localized region through which people proceed related to it as a whole. So a workplace, a town square, a train compartment. This is the kind of place of which people speak of a sense of place. So there was a long many years where people discussed the notion of a sense of place. And so that's the kind of place. Now, I have argued that these are all the notions of space one needs. Now, one has to add to this, I think, this very abstract notion of space is multiplicity. And this is partly because people speak of this type of space all the time. It's simply the space of X is the range of X's. So perhaps the most prominent example of this is the notion of a space of possibilities. So the X here is possibilities, and a space of possibility is simply all the possibilities. That's all it is. And, you know, whether that's a good entity to use to analyze social life, I've argued against that, but whatever. I mean, lots of people. So we might want to bring in space as multiplicity as some very abstract sort of notion, which in some sense is not, I think, is not actually a feature of the world, whereas these are features of the world. But that would be something to talk about. Okay, now, what's the issue? Well, lots of people have introduced notions of virtual, digital, cyber, etc. spaces. And now one sees, both in academic and non-academic literature, pervasive references to these. And when people talk about how, you know, digitally informed economic phenomena work, for instance, there's constant reference to virtual and digital space. And my view is there no need, and these are typically understood, we have to be clear about this, as spaces that are accessed through devices, typically through the screen. So one, you know, and if you think about the way we use language, we use language in a way to abet this. We talk about navigating to a website, you know, a highly spatial notion. And there's endless use of spatial language to describe what's going on when a person is typing in reaction to what they perceive on the screen. Now, my view is there are no such spaces, that this is, I don't know what it's a hangover. It's an what's the word in English? I kind of Überbleibsel in German. It's, you know, something, a remnant from an earlier idea. And so, for instance, to give you a sense of why we don't need this. So instead of thinking of entering a digital virtual space, which really suggests there's something you go into, that there's really a space there, that instead what one should think of is the idea that there can be a group of people, multiple people, who are grasping and reacting to what they see on the screens, which then coordinates with what appears on other screens, and all of which is determined by algorithms. So what you have to do instead is a group of people, however that group's defined, who are connected via the algorithmically served up connections on their screen and what types of reactions and typings and one has in reaction to it. So let me give you an example of this. I want to bring back in Kishona Gray and her example of people live streaming themselves playing games. She, especially when she's talking about African-American lesbians, she refers to this as streaming as a counter-hegemonic space. Okay? And so this way of talking, of course, is a carryover from the notion of a safe place, which is a kind of encompassing place, which are actual locations in the world that we live through. And now it's being transposed over into the digital realm. But what's really going on here is that individuals of a certain identity who face varying levels of hostility in the worlds that they go through find that they can connect with others through their devices, through what they see, and communicate thereby, all while they are sitting at their own seats, chairs, in their cars, wherever they are. And so we have an curious association connected of people who feel safer, who feel some type of level of security, which is denied them outside that particular practice. And so there is no counter-hegemonic space there. What we have is the technology is enabling a certain type of association and set of practices which offer a certain type of psychological, emotional benefit to the people who can participate in that. And so we don't need any notion of virtual, digital, cyberspace. And in fact, I think these notions are mystifying. So, okay, I'll stop there then. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for this inspiring talk, Theodor. So it's time to move to the questions. I cannot see the people online, but if some of them want to ask questions, you can ask them directly. Yes, maybe I can start with two questions. You said something at some point, I'm not sure to understand. You say that with digitality, practices lose their ceremoniality. I have the intuition that they settle new forms of digitality, but maybe I misunderstood what you meant by ceremoniality. And my other question is about method. In the room here, many people are qualitative researchers. Many of them do ethnographic research, which is a practice. And at the end, what is your advice in our practice as ethnographer not to forget this combination of time and space that you stressed?
Okay. Well, here, let me bring the screen back up here. So what I mean by ceremonial is mentioned here. So this is Wendy James' analysis. So there are certain rules about it could be movement through space, the use of space, and also time, the use of time. And she's thinking objective space and time, but I think time space should be brought in there. So these are rules then about the teleology, motivation, and lay out the array of places and paths amidst which a person proceeds. So there are rules, and then action sequencing, a sense, however one wants that to be thought in a Bourdieu type of sense, a practical sense, and then a style and a rhythm to the whole thing. And so what I do think that when a person, see, this is key. She's an anthropologist. This is very much key to practices in which you have multiple people interacting with each other. And in fact, in the book, I was thinking of practices of that sort and was not thinking about what happens when suddenly you have practices in which the multiplicity of people are there, but they're not interacting, or the interactions are quite different now. And so, and in fact, 1, 2, and 3, or elements of this, do fall away to some extent when it's an algorithm, in a sense, that is producing what's on the screen that then the person is reacting to or carrying out an action by virtue of typing something on the screen and entering something into a text box somewhere. And so that's the sense in which these things are being lost. But then I gave a counterexample of the live streaming of the playing of the game. But then again, what we've reintroduced is that type of interactive dimension among humans, which is now simply being mediated digitally. And thus it's you might say it's not gone as far as a more thorough digitalization, which would seem to lose this. Now, one can imagine that think of ChatGPT. Think of the types of robots that exist now that interact with people. It could be that ceremonialness will come back when the practices start in a real way to start involving robotic entities. And it may be that the algorithms that control these, or the way the learning programs work, reintroduce elements like this. So it could be that that's the future evolution, but that's not, when you purchase something online, there's no ceremonialness anymore. But if you go into a store, there still is. So that's the contrast, and the future is speculative. And okay, so methodologically, I have to admit that I feel I am still learning about method. I, of course, was a philosopher, and philosophers, the notion of method vis-a-vis philosophy is an odd one. Kishona Gray, the person whose book I was referring to, her book is entirely qualitative research, and she entered those communities. And there's an interesting, of course, what facilitated that in this case is that one often enters these communities anonymously. And only eventually does one, and this, of course, became an issue when she was entering the communities of the African-American males, because she is a female, and I presume a lesbian, though I don't know. And of course, that was not safe space, shall we say. But she, it was a matter of participating, talking. She had transcripts that she analyzed in great depth afterwards. And so I'm not saying anything that is of use, I think, to people who do qualitative research, but she effectively combined that type of textual analysis and talk connection with people. So I'm going to take a pass beyond that, because I don't do empirical research, and so I do not have any particular, I think, great insights to offer on that.
Thank you. I don't know if there are other questions from the room or from people online. It's the end of a very intense day. For some people in the room, it's the second very, very intense day. So I try to share something probably you cannot hear from far. People are very interested, but extremely tired. Any other questions or remarks? Yes, two questions. Maybe we will collect all the questions, and then feel free to pick up to select.
Theodor, is very quick questions. As far as I understand, you said that studying massive multiplayers online games, you did not recognize much differences. Is that what you said?
On the point of teleology.
Could you explain that with some more details?
Somewhat what?
Details, some more information about that?
No, I was speaking, that comment was concerning the doubling of teleology. There are other elements which are utterly different. So, for instance, one of the fascinating things about playing these games is the use of the body of the person who is sitting at the computer, and the way the merging of that body with the body in online. And I do think that is something quite different and of great interest, and needs a good analysis. I do not follow gaming studies, so I presume that there's a lot of discussion there. There are also all these interesting issues about perception. There are all these interesting issues about, for instance, the sociality of the association in the game, the type of group that you're part of, and do principles of social organization and association, in the non-gaming world, do they get reproduced in some way, and in or independently of the way the algorithm sets up and serves up events and possibilities in the game. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff here, which is different, I think. But I was speaking about the teleology in particular here. And that's because that connects with the time of time space. And so I've always been fascinated about this doubling of teleology. And as it seems to be some sort of necessary condition of social life that it's occurring. And so here it is happening in the digital sphere too. And so that was the point of the observation there. There's so much more to be said about gaming.
So thank you. My question is precisely on this notion of doubling of teleology, which I found to be a fascinating notion, and the example of the sports player's motivation as compared to the collective teleology of the team. And I think that in some cases, at least in the real world, there's a third teleology, which would be that of the company that owns the team that is using this game as a business model, right? And so with that in mind, what occurs to me in the digital realm is that no matter what the action, individually or socially, all of that activity is datafied in such a way that it can be fed into a business model in a way that real world action is not. And so whether there is some kind of third teleology that's ubiquitous across the digital realm, whereas it would only be partial in the kind of material physical realm. Not everything is business in the real world, but I think everything could at least potentially be business on the digital world because everything is a data flow.
That's interesting. I'd have to hear more about that because I thought you were going to say it's the other way around, because I'd have to hear more about in what sense things online cannot be, I forgot what word you use, sort of corporatized in some sort of way. These games, of course, are all produced by corporations. There's a small number of game producers who hire all the code writers to create these games. So I'm not sure what in it couldn't be monetized in some way. And it seems to me I don't know a whole lot about games, but this is a constant point of contention in games between the monetization introduced by the producer and distributors of the games and the at least ambivalence on the part of the users vis-a-vis this point. And there's some interesting things I've read about tokens and the use of tokens in the ways that connect in all kinds of indirect ways to monetization. So that it's interesting, and that's something I'd like to hear more about. What was the third? You said there's a third teleology that that pervades the digital realm, and what was that third? That's the monetization one.
Yes, I was basically thinking about the company's goals. Yeah, and I think I was saying is that in the digital world, everything could potentially have that third teleology, whereas in the physical world, it would only be sometimes where you would get it, and it wouldn't be all in every situation.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure what I see in principle difference between the two. It may be that the forms of resistance that are possible are different in the two cases, such that the de facto extent of monetization might vary, but I don't see how one or the other could, in principle, anything could be, in principle, outside of possible monetization. I mean, you could say something like love, but I'm not sure the digital, non-digital really bears on that.
Thank you very much. Thank you again, Theodor, for this great talk. Thank you so much. For us here in Grenoble, it's time to close this seventh RGCS symposium. It was great to conclude this symposium with you, Theodor. Great conclusion. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you.
We know that you love ski, and we hope that you will visit this area soon. It's really worth it. And so it was good to meet all of you in the real world in person for this new RGCS symposium. I hope there will be a lot of awards. I wanted to say again one thank you to the organizer because you see some visible activities, but you can get a lot of So thank you again for all that, and see you soon in the context of other events. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Est-ce que tous les fichiers qui ont été enregistrés, il sera possible de d'envoyer les liens publics de Zoom
Eh bien,
à Emmanuel Costa?
eh bien, faut que je les mette sur clé parce qu'en fait, c'est pas notre ordinateur.
Ah,
Et
c'est pas sur un compte
la
Zoom
clé.
où on pourrait juste partager les liens publics parce que Emmanuel est au courant, et après il connaît la manip, il les mettra en ligne sur la chaîne YouTube. Et si c'est juste un lien public, il suffit de mettre dans un mail les liens
Si
publics.
c'est